Hello and welcome. I'm Dana Bibi of the programs team at the Columbia Global Center in Amman. Thank you for joining us today for a reading and conversation with Dalia Azim. We're delighted to bring you a discussion of her book, Country of Origin. Dalia was born in Canada and raised in the United States. Her writing has appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, American Short Fiction, Aperture, Glimmer Train, and Other Voices, among other places. She is the new deputy director at the Texas Book Festival. Country of Origin is her first book. It connects us to a multi-generational family saga that cuts between political revolution in 1950s Egypt and the personal revolutions of four family members whose lives intersect around the disappearance of one of their own. The book has been described as a novel of immense power and revelation, as it is the kind of brilliant novel that breaks you open and puts you back together by the last page. Dalia's writing has been called by reviewers as lyrical, piercing, epic, and transporting. Publishers Weekly celebrates Country of Origin as an evocative debut, insightful and nuanced. We're pleased to be involved and to have the opportunity to share this work with a broader audience. The Global Centers are hubs of Columbia University, currently in 9 cities around the world, that work with students, faculty, and regional partners to create opportunities for shared learning and research, and to deepen the nature of global dialogue on a range of issues. This book talk is our 7th in a series that features Arab authors to showcase some of the breadth and diversity in Arab fiction writing. Country of Origin is a gripping, fascinating book. Its thematic focus on identity and independence intertwines evocatively with the mesmerizing portrayal of human experiences across generations and nations. Dalia vividly captures the difficult intersection of immigration and cultural continuity, individuality and family, grief and love. The vivid portrayals of the characterizations in the micro and Egypt in the macro are singularly unique. These topics are so important today in the Middle East, in the Arab diaspora abroad, as well as in any society entrenched in dynamic change. This is a compelling, compassionate book that will imprint and resonate in your mind. I would now like to hand over to Ladan Nasiri, our moderator for this conversation. Ladan is a journalist and writer. She led Iran's coverage at Bloomberg News' regional headquarters in Dubai after spending 6 years as the company's Tehran-based correspondent and 14 years overall at Bloomberg TV and radio. Ladan has reported from Tehran, Beirut, Dubai, Muscat, as well as Paris, London, Vienna, Frankfurt, Zurich, Geneva, New York, and Washington, D.C. Ladan has also moderated panels for the Atlantic Council and Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Her reporting has appeared in international outlets, including the New York Times, the LA Times, and Business Week. She is the 2021-2022 Nonfiction Fellow for Emerging Writers at the Denver-based Lighthouse Writers Workshop and the recipient of other awards and fellowships from Slice Literary, Writing by Writers, and the New York State Summer Writing Institute. She has taught creative writing to young students from underserved neighborhoods in New York City and now serves as a nonfiction instructor at Lighthouse. Ladan holds a Master of International Affairs from Columbia University and a Master of Fine Arts and Literary Nonfiction from the New School in New York. Thank you again to everyone in our virtual audience for being with us. Please do send in your questions through the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, and they will be addressed in this webinar. Please join me in welcoming Ladan.
Thank you so much for this introduction, Dana. I'm very glad that we're holding this event and very honored to be in the company of such accomplished women. Before starting off our talk today, I wanted to invite Dalia to read an extract from her book, because I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with Country of Origin or have had the chance of read the book yet. And so to kind of put us in the mood, I think it would be fantastic if Dalia would read us a couple of pages.
Yes, thank you so much, Ladan and Dana and Columbia Centers. It's such an honor to be here, and I really appreciate your celebration and amplification of Arab and Arab American voices, and honored to be a part of it. I'm, as Ladan said, I'm going to read just from the beginning of the novel, just to sort of set the tone and help you understand the point of entry into this book. Hala, 1952. Rima and I watched from the roof as the city burned. It was not a single inferno, but a scattering of fires across the river, downtown. Flames devouring buildings, cars burning in the roads, tiny people running around carrying glowing sticks. Smoke painted the sky gray, and the air smelled like how I imagined cigarettes tasted. I hadn't known that anything was awry when I went down to the kitchen for tea that morning, just a quarter of an hour before. There I found Rima engaged in hushed, excited dialogue with Abu Abdallah about an uprising in the streets. As a courtesy to me, Abu Abdallah ducked outside the side door as soon as I entered the room. The majority of our interactions involved me staring at the back of his turbaned head as he silently chauffeured me back and forth to school. Once Abu Abdallah was gone, I asked Rima if we could go up to the roof. It felt foolish at 14 to seek permission, but the only way to access the roof was via a set of rustic stone stairs off the kitchen, which I'd always considered Rima's domain. I led and she followed behind me at a slower pace, breathing heavily. Besides school, the roof was the closest I came to experiencing the outside world, so it had always been my favorite part of the house. As far as I knew, my parents never ventured up there, saw no reason to. Sometimes my mother would smell the chickens on me after I'd been up to collect their eggs with Rima, and she would make her displeasure clear. "Have you been around those dirty birds again?" Buildings burned alongside structures that stood untouched by flame. "Do you think this is it?" I asked Rima as I stared at the spectacle across the Nile. "I don't know what this is," Rima responded in a flat tone, also transfixed by the blazes. After a few minutes, she suggested that we go back downstairs in case my parents were looking for us. We both knew that my mother never emerged from her bedroom before noon, and my father liked to sleep in on days when he didn't have to work. My parents had separate bedrooms and kept to their own schedules. The only time we all came together was around the dinner table for the afternoon meal. When we returned to the kitchen and found it empty, Rima said I should go tell my parents what was happening. She played up her subservience when it suited her. "They shouldn't hear about this from me," she said. I knocked on my father's door first. I'd always been closer to him than to my mother, but recently he'd started talking about interviewing suitors on my behalf, and my feelings toward him had soured somewhat. Sounding far away, my father asked, "What is it?" in a raspy voice. "It's Hala," I told him through the door, as if there could be any confusion about my identity. "Downtown is burning. I think this is something you should see." Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dalia. I think that the start of the book, especially just this few graphs that you read for us, it very much sets the scene insofar as we start getting acquainted with Hala, which is who's one of the main protagonists in the book. But also we get a very clear sense of the backdrop of this story at the time that we're catching it, which is the Egyptian Revolution of 1952. And so in those first few pages, or I would say in the first couple chapters, we get a sense of intimacy with Hala because, the story is told in the first person. And it's really, we get a sense of her political awakening. We get a sense of, her awakening to injustices that she sees outside, but also within her household. And also we later on get a sense of, her kind of sexual awakening as well. It's very much the evolution of this young girl at the same time as it's happening at a key time in Egypt's history. And so I really wanted to get our discussion started from the beginning, which is, what prompted your decision to want to start the story in the 1950s, and why was it important for you to set the story in that era of Egypt?
Thank you, and thanks for that really sensitive reading of the book as well, or Hala's character and the book in general. I would say that originally I was drawn to to exploring Egypt as it was emerging from the colonial era and into independence. So that was of primary interest to me. And then sort of what came on top of that when I started exploring these female characters, and especially Hala, is setting their experiences as women, or her experience as a young woman in the 1950s, against the sort of political climate of liberation that is imminent for the country, and really having it awaken in her this sense of what could freedom look like for me? Because for her, really nothing changes, and in fact, her life becomes a bit more claustrophobic after the revolution. Just essentially a few pages beyond what I read, she is asked to stay home from school. It's perceived as unsafe for her to be out and to continue going to school. And also, what's the point? Because she'll be getting married shortly anyway, so she might as well just stay home and bide her time until the appropriate suitor comes into the picture. So for her, this is really the kind of double standard or hypocrisy that she starts to perceive as a young woman in this time is really what kind of clarifies her search for sort of an exit strategy or a sense of what freedom could look like for her.
You and I have spoken at the time that the book was coming out, and so I remember that we talked a little bit about Hala's character at the time, and I think that this discussion around, her personality, or her desires for more independence, to be able to take certain, make certain choices for her future. I think this, we see an echo of that very much nowadays with the politics in the region, in particular with what's happening in Iran, where we see very young girls, express desire to kind of have more agency. The first time that I read the book, I felt that Hala was a bit, she seemed to me to be a bit more conservative. And this time when I read it, with, looking forward to a discussion, I felt that she was, she really is the person who sets a chain of events in motion. The story starts with her, and whether, it's out of her impulsive tendencies or kind of unconsciously, she makes certain decisions that will impact everyone around her. And so, I would love to hear you talk more about what was important for you in wanting to portray this young lady, and also the other character, the other female character in the book, which is her daughter Amina.
Mm-hmm. Well, definitely this sense that she sort of sets things in motion through I definitely wanted it to read as sort of what she chooses to do. And I know we'll try to talk about this without giving too much away. So talking a little bit abstractly, but essentially the choices that she makes in Egypt in the 50s, and the future that she chooses for herself, which is separate from what her father and mother would choose for her. It really is, it's her striking out at independence and seeking independence for herself, where she sees that it's not a possibility otherwise. But it's also with her and then her daughter later on, I wanted to explore this subtext of potential mental health, mental illness. And so I wanted this reading to be sort of inflected with, if you read Hala sort of straight and didn't have any sense of what was coming, you might just think she's an impulsive teenager, and that's a very fair reading. But once you have the whole picture of the book, and you later experience her daughter and what her daughter deals with in terms of her mental health, and then reflect back, you see how this might be part of the lineage that Amina has inherited. And even further, and I don't go very deeply into this, Hala's mother, who's like a very reclusive, depressive character who really kind of stays in her bedroom. I wanted to portray this sense of like of this, one of, like I said, one of the legacies that carries through this lineage of women is potentially, their struggles with mental health, and also to highlight the fact that there is no language around that until you get to the US in more contemporary times. And then I didn't want it to be anachronistic and to start labeling or ascribing labels to Hala or her mother at a time when they wouldn't have been labeled as such, and would be seen just sort of straight the way that hopefully I portrayed them. But I did want that sort of like retrospective sort of epiphany for the reader, like, oh, this makes sense, and I put this puzzle together and it really comes together in this way that makes sense in a way that it hadn't necessarily reading it from the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely the sense I got on the second read, where all the clues were there. I was like, oh my God, okay. So you talk about later on in the book where we move on to another continent, another city. This is a book. The part of the beauty of it is like it's a multi-generational saga, and it's across continents, across countries, across decades, spanning from mid 1950s to mid 1980s. And I know you wanted this aspect of wanting it to be a multi-generational story was very important to you. What was it that you were hoping to capture about the immigrant experience, or perhaps, the Arab American experience in, stretching this story over time?
That's a great question. And honestly, I think at the start, and maybe even through the conclusion of writing this book, my impulse was to write into what I felt like was sort of a gap in literature, at least in literature in English. The books that I have found myself drawn to for years, 20, 30 years, are often multi-generational sagas about different diasporas, like Chimamanda Adichie or Jhumpa Lahiri or Junot Diaz, Mohsen Hamid. There's so many, and Julia Otsuka. There's basically all of my favorite books were books that traced the multi-generational experience of a family who immigrates from one culture and largely to the US is what I'm talking about. And that's what I was reading, and that's what I felt like I could write. But I was not finding much about the Arab American experience. And at the same time, I was emerging as a writer in the early 2000s when it felt like the portrayals of Arabs in Western culture were not positive. Often, this sort of like the trope of like the terrorist, or just I wanted to counter that and also tell like a family story that was just, kind of steeped in like sort of normal everyday experience in some ways. I mean, it's not normal every day, but it also isn't this extreme of what I feel like I was seeing in movies and television. And then again, in literature, not seeing very much of. So that was sort of the impulse. And now, and you and I had this conversation a little bit recently, but I feel like there is sort of this mini renaissance, and at least in the last maybe decade, maybe half a decade, where there's suddenly, I feel like, a lot more of us on the literary scene, and it's really empowering and exciting, like the sense of community and that Arab voices, because even then, I mean, I would be really reticent to try to like be the token voice. Like I think every kind of culture needs a diversity of voices to kind of speak to the diversity of experience, and so that things don't get tokenized and kind of oversimplified. So I'm thrilled to see that there are a lot of diverse voices emerging around these experiences now.
Yeah, this is definitely something that I wanted us to kind of look at a bit deeper, which is, we're hearing a lot in literature the question of, who has the right to tell this story. And I think that, on one hand, as you said, there wasn't much of the representation of Arab American experience or, Arab American immigrant experience in the US. So on one hand, I would tend to think that, the more we get to hear, just for the sake of the representation, the more we get to have a sense of, okay, there are also a significant portion of Americans who are of Arab origins, and we need to have those individuals in our stories. So on one hand, I feel like anyone who has the intention of telling that story can kind of help making this part of the community more, this community more visible. On the other hand, I feel, when we get representation that isn't very, that lacks depth, that also can be it's not even that it's not effective, it's actually damaging. So, where is the fine line in wanting to be more visible, but at the same time wanting to kind of have a visibility that is actually representative of this culture, of this community? If you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question. And you're right. I think that it can go both ways, and it can, if executed incorrectly, and if it gets sort of wide distribution, I think it can be damaging and can reflect really poorly on the author and their book, and then in a larger way on maybe the culture they're trying to portray. But I mean, until today, I've spent most of my career, all of my career in the visual art world, where the questions of cultural appropriation have also hit sort of a boiling point in the last few years. And so I feel like I've talked about it a lot in my work life and also in my book life. And for me, I guess it comes down to intent, because I feel like artists and writers, really the driver, at least for me, it's about cultural empathy and trying to understand something. I mean, I wasn't a woman who grew up in Egypt in the 50s. I was born to immigrants in Canada in the 70s. And really a lot of what I wrote is imaginative. It's not my personal experience. I mean, I'm closer to the source in that a lot of family stories are sort of but I did a lot of research, like anybody who would write historical fiction would necessarily need to do to get it right. At the same time, I feel like it's this whole sort of stay in your lane conversation that happens around cultural appropriation, I think is a bit dangerous, just because, well, for a few reasons. I think that I don't think that Arabs or Arab Americans have like the sole right to explore these questions or these characters. And on the other side, the book that I'm working on next, most likely, is among Americans, white Americans in Egypt in the 30s. It's an archaeology book. And do I have the right to tell that story? So it's sort of a little bit double-edged for me in terms of like, what stories do I have the right to tell? And then not wanting to limit what other creative people can do. But I do think it's about who gets the attention, who gets amplified. We were speaking about this a couple of weeks ago, that what in this sort of like desert of stories on Arab and Arab American experience, I remember very distinctly Martin Amis had written this story, The Last Days of Muhammad Atta, about one of the 9/11 hijackers, and it was in the New Yorker. And I think honestly, it was like very well done, but it made me feel very uncomfortable at the time. And I think the discomfort not only was that it was highlighting, again, this sort of stereotype and the most extreme version of what Westerners were already seeing, in terms of Arab characters, but also there just wasn't a counter. There weren't Arab voices to also, to like add depth to what stories were out there, to add, breadth and depth. And so I think it's tricky, and I don't have like a very, I definitely, I know writers and I know art historians, I know critics who would say like, you just have to be careful. You have to kind of steer clear of those areas that are not directly attached to your experience, but I'm a little wary of that interpretation.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad, though. I mean, this is definitely something that you mentioned, and I have felt. I do feel as you do that. There are more. We are hearing more voices actually from this community, and whether it's translated books or just books that are written in English. So I need to ask you this question about the title of the book, Country of Origin. I know that for those of you who are lucky enough to read this book, you will get a sense of, why it's called Country of Origin later on. But so I'm not going to go there. However, I wanted to ask a question with regards to your own background. So you were born in Canada, raised in the US, and I couldn't, I couldn't help but wonder how the writing of this book, whether to some extent it was your way of revisiting your heritage. And, I've heard many authors tell me that, you enter writing a book as one person and then you come out of it as another person. You're changed by the book that you write. And I wonder whether you had this experience and, to what extent writing this book perhaps helped deepen your understanding of yourself as a second generation immigrant and as an Arab American.
Oh, that's a lovely question. I hadn't really thought about that, but I think most certainly it did shift my experience and make me more knowledgeable about my own history and where I come from. I think the simple question about the title and country of origin, it's actually a title I came to pretty late in the process, but then it seemed very obvious that that was the right title for this book, and it had resonance across a number of characters, a number of their experiences, from just a sense of longing as an immigrant, but also racism faced by other characters abroad, and there is this, I guess it was sort of speaking to this. My sense as the child of immigrants, as a first generation immigrant, of this, like, where are you from, or where are you really from? This like sort of the complexity and never knowing how to answer. And for me, I'm like, well, grew up in Colorado, born in Canada. My parents, it ends up being a very kind of long answer, and I'm not really sure. I kind of usually assume that they want to understand, like, ethnically where I'm coming from, but it's an ambiguous question, and I I sort of stumble my way through it all the time still. So I think in some ways, that's a simple way to answer the question of how that title got appended to my book, but I do think it really speaks to different experiences of the characters. But to your question of whether I emerged a different person, I think that's it's a really lovely way to think about it. I think that I likely began this process feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome as somebody who never has lived in Egypt. I've spent a lot of time there. When I grew up, we would go and spend a month, every year and a half. My parents had immigrated for graduate school, and really all of their families were back in Cairo. And so that's where we would go. And that's where I had this sense of myself as connected to this larger web of people, this larger culture. In the US, I had like a handful of relatives, and none of them in Colorado where we were. I had an aunt in New York, some family in Atlanta, and a cousin in California, but that was kind of the extent of it. So it really felt, it was really moving to go to Egypt and sense myself as part of this, certainly part of this larger family, but also part of this larger culture. And I have no doubt that the reason I wanted to be a writer, and I decided to be a writer when I was young, when I was a teenager, and first, doing these visits in some ways, it was about trying to understand myself in some ways and where I came from, and also like a deep curiosity about the history, which had seemed to me, a revolution in the 50s, it just seemed like it had, and then again in 2011, while I was still working on this book, it just seemed like the culture was in this state of transformation in a way that the US, while of course is always shifting, just didn't feel like it was on the crux of like transformative change. So that was something that I found really compelling to explore. But I certainly emerged, I think, with a deeper understanding of where I came from, and probably like a more confident sense of myself as an Egyptian. And that's part of the diasporic experience. My experience is as valid as anybody else's. It's just different.
Right. I think this is something that, every immigrant grapples with, kind of like, this question of home and where do they fit, and, what their experience, kind of wanting to express that and trying to find the right outlet for that. So one question that I have is regarding, we're going to slowly move on now to more craft-oriented questions, because I know that some in the audience are writers, and I personally always love to hear about, how the book came about, in very tangible ways. So one question that I have is regarding, the entry point for this book. I've heard, some authors say that it's a character that kind of, they start envisioning a character, and that's, what kind of propels the narrative. I've heard, authors kind of be extremely excited by, one vision of something. I remember a discussion that I had a while back with Nicole Krauss, and for her, it was a hotel that she used to go with her parents when she was a kid. And so like this building suddenly, just became an impetus for her to write a story. What was it? I mean, if you're able to think back to the early days, what was like the starting point for you? What was like the driving element? Was it an image? Was it a character? Was it, a story that you had loosely in mind?
I think if it had been that specific, I might have had a more efficient process, but really I just came at this book with this sense of wanting, kind of to the point, the question that you had earlier, this drive to write a multi-generational story about an immigrant family from Egypt that arrives, in the 1950s, 1960s. So I literally came at the story backwards. I started by writing like a generation further removed than where I actually ended the book. And part of that is just when I started to write, it was in the early 2000s. And I thought that the best point of entry, or the point of entry that would make the most sense, which now in retrospect seems very heavy-handed and wrong, was 9/11. And so I had like what would have been Amina's daughter as like the central character for these sections of the book. And then really just started interrogating my curiosity about that line, going backwards. And so really I ended up flipping the book and starting in the 50s in Egypt at a different, sort of like high drama moment in a lot of ways, but that seemed more central to what compels these characters, and like you said earlier, sort of launches the story that then plays out over generations. But it was really sort of the sense of this family more than a specific character, and Cairo as a character. My long love of and fascination with Cairo, and just wanting to sort of explore that in like a more kind of tactile way, sensory way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I think I would do it differently next time. I think I would definitely maybe have more line. That's what I'm working on with the next book, is have more of a sense of what is the story, not necessarily like what's the kind of shape or what's the yeah, I've learned some things. I guess we all do.
I think I've heard that, we learn with every book. So I've heard you talk about the kind of narrative engine for this book, and you said that took shape once you realized that you were going to write this story through multiple perspectives, and sorry, my cat just jumped here. What did you think this choice of telling the story through multiple characters, what do you think that it allowed you to do that you would not have been able otherwise to do in terms of how to tell the story?
That's a really good question. I think that, well, one, it allows me to really explore the lineage, like in terms of the generational aspect. So if I had just followed one character, I wouldn't have been able to explore the experience over generations and countries in the same way that I had intended to. And then as the sort of canvas for the story grew, I became very interested not only in this lineage of women, but also the men that are connected to them and what their stories may have been. So Amina's father, the man who Hala eventually marries, he has experience fighting in the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, and then is connected to sort of the political machine that takes over when the revolution begins in the 50s. And then I had actually, while it kind of gets in some ways buried later in the book, one of the stories I really wanted to explore that was something that it came to me very early on and comes from experiences of distant family members is the sort of political incarceration of perceived enemies of the state and the sort of long-term languishing in prison that happens to one of the characters. So I guess it was sort of a stubbornness to not give up any aspect of it and to figure out how to make it fit together. So it was more like I knew the different characters and their trajectories. And so the real challenge was, how do I make it cohesive and how do I make them all connected? Like, it took me a while to figure out how Hassan's incarceration might connect to Hala and Khalil's marriage, for instance. And that wasn't necessarily the case in some earlier drafts. So to really kind of tighten up the narrative and have it be kind of more integrated was a bigger craft challenge. And I had other characters, other perspectives. There was another brother at some point. So I had to consolidate. My impulse was definitely like to sprawl. And I feel like a lot of books that I admired when I started writing this and still admire they jump perspectives. And I think that it can be really profound seeing the same experience from different people's perspective. It's kind of like the Rashomon experience of like, depending on who's telling the story, it's a completely different story. And I find that really interesting. And also the way in which, and in my book, I worked at trying to have these layers where as you see another person's perspective, it adds layers and it kind of inflects what you've experienced through another character's eyes earlier with something you might not have understood before.
Absolutely. And I feel that, the narrative arc in part is around the disappearance of one of the characters. And I feel like that really propels you. And with each chapter and with each additional perspective, you start putting things together. So I feel like the construction of it as well, insofar as there's an element of mystery that is present. So we have a series of questions. I'm going to invite the audience to, any questions you have. We're going to get to the Q&A in a couple of seconds, actually, because we have a lot of questions here for you, Dalia. So let's see. As you depict the journey of the protagonist in Egypt and outside, what is the core point you have aimed to show concerning this immigrant Arab-American character?
I think, well, the challenge for me as a writer is to sort of understand a whole and deep character. And so to really sort of propel myself imaginatively into what this experience is. The part that's closest to my own experience, which it was sort of the point of entry of the book, not literally in terms of how it starts, but how I got into writing the book, was this experience of being between two cultures and not feeling fully like part of either of them. And that's such a universal experience, I think, for immigrants and first generation immigrants. And so for me is sort of trying to capture the emotional landscape of somebody who's in that in between and is going back and forth and trying to understand, for instance, how life may have been different, or if, how certain choices just affect everything.
So I have a question around mental health here, and I feel that I would invite you to read the book because I actually don't want Dalia to give away too much. But I'm going to ask you the question, and you can answer however you see fit, Dalia. Can you talk a bit more about mental health and how you went about integrating it into the novel? I think this is an element sometimes not talked about enough due to social stigma.
Sure. Yeah, the stigma around it, I thought, was something that, like we were talking about earlier, that while Hala in the 1950s may very much be manifesting some symptoms of like a mental health crisis, it's not something that would have been really looked at seriously or treated or diagnosed. I also wanted to explore this sense, and I think for both her and for Amina, that there isn't an inevitability around it, but really it's sort of circumstances, and it's like the epigenetic component of mental health, that it may be like in the genes, or there might be a predisposition, but really what triggers it are experiences that, and for both of them, I think either feeling isolated or trapped, or lost and disconnected. So there are different triggers for both of them, and it manifests in different ways. But for Amina, I mean, there is, she starts to really understand, and through conversations with her father, she pieces together her mother's experience, and it sheds light on some of what happens to her in retrospect. But yeah, I agree. It's not something that I feel like I do think that there again is more literature emerging that touches on this topic, but I don't feel like it's been that prevalent. And especially looking at women in these sort of patriarchal cultures, and how that might push them in a certain direction.
Absolutely. I have a question here on 9/11. I think you touched on that earlier, but so here's the question. And how did 9/11 affect the novel, and how is it reflected in the narrative?
Ultimately, it's what went into like my computer's recycling bin, I think, in terms of how it actually impacts the novel directly, because at a certain point, I felt like I too was being really reductive in including 9/11 as sort of a touch point for this story, and realized sort of belatedly in this process that I could just completely elide that. And actually it made it much simpler. It's like, that's not the heart of the story. It was a way to explore a character who felt uneasy about her own Arab American identity. But and maybe that's a story I'll tell in a different way later. But really, when I found my way into the heart of the story, it was more about, why the family, how and why the family leaves Egypt, and then sort of how that affects the coming generations. But ultimately, I think 9/11 is sort of just, for me, it was the way that I found my way into the story. And then ultimately, it is not in there anymore. So I don't know, maybe Ladan, you have a different reading, but I don't really think it has. I mean, it ends, I made a decision ultimately to end the story in the 80s, which also allowed me to not even go there, as they say.
Yeah, it seems to me that it was very much part of your thought process, and it's thinking about it that allowed you to get to this current manifestation of the book. But yeah, I don't see it really as part of the narrative either. So I have a question here, which fits into a bigger question that I had. So I'm gonna ask you both together. So we have someone asked, did you listen to any old Egyptian songs or watch any films when writing this novel? I love this question. I would love you to talk about, the kind of historic research that you mentioned earlier, how you went about doing that, given that you had not lived in Egypt, certainly not at that time. So, what were your methods, your approach to just get the not only, the kind of factual research, but also, like create this mood at that time in that place?
Absolutely. Well, it's a very apt question, because I relied very heavily on listening to music and looking at archival photographs. I think that before I started writing, that was sort of like a Sunday ritual in the house where I grew up. It wasn't necessarily always Arabic music, but my parents had a couple of albums. They had, I think my mother's favorite was Abdul Halim Hafez, and then there's Kulthum and Fairuz. And then with the advent of platforms like Spotify, I was able to explore more and listen. But definitely writing the sections in Egypt, I found that such a shortcut almost into like imagining the world, and photographs too. And then part of that is, I think, just my background in visual art and how visual cues really help kind of help me leap into world building in sort of an imaginative way. I feel like some of the oldest advice I got as a writer is something that's still very effective for me, which is like when I'm stuck, especially to really think about evoking the five senses, what does this scene look like, feel like, smell like, sound like? And so part of that is kind of adding that texture. So where there might be like little cameos by some of the musicians that I married, just to give some sort of cultural context and just to kind of get the history right. It informed me a lot more than is actually on the page, but definitely listening to music was really a moving part of the experience. And it's funny, my Arabic is not great. I speak Egyptian Arabic okay, and I often can't listen to music with lyrics. I find it very disruptive to my writing process, but I think I'm just naive enough about Arabic that I can listen to it and it just feels more atmospheric to me. So that's the type of music I can listen to kind of set me in that world, creatively. And then images, really grateful for the archives of images from my family, but also it's in some ways hard to imagine. I guess I could have traveled across the world and visited different archives, but the internet was a great friend in terms of just like unearthing archival images. There's a great foundation called the Arab Image Foundation. I think they're still based in Beirut. That was a great resource for looking up images. If I want to find, for instance, what Tahrir Square looked like in 1950s or something, just to not transpose my experience, which would be anachronistic, onto a past where I didn't experience it. But yeah, that's a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, and I have another one, which I think you addressed here. The world building is very complex and enjoyable. Do you have any tips or advice you can share, if you have anything additional to what you mentioned?
I would say, besides what I've mentioned, I don't know if there's for me, I don't know if there was a way to achieve that without sort of over researching and probably overwriting and then pulling back what seemed excessive. Like I really had to set myself into the mindset of writing this book, which meant a lot of understanding that those decades in Egypt. And then with the research, I had this impulse, which I know other writers have as well, to just like include as much as possible, for efficiency and to make use of all that hard work. But really the trick was about sort of figuring out what was essential to the story. I didn't ever want the writing to seem didactic. I've been asked the question, which I guess I'll go ahead and ask myself in this Q&A. In some ways, I think it's interesting to think about, like, who is the audience, and which I was asked that recently, and I think ideally the audience is broad and it's not Westerners or Arabs like in the Middle East. I would hope that both sides could come to the book and not feel like it's belittling their knowledge or that it's over their heads in terms of, I don't know anything about Egypt. How would I understand this book? Like, I hope that there's enough sort of cultural context and clues and more about, I think when you build a world and characters, it should be immersive and it shouldn't be it should be a place where anybody can kind of settle in and imagine themselves. Think about science fiction, it's like that. Does that have, I guess, science fiction readers are the audience for that. But I do think that it's kind of an apt analogy in terms of, if you create a world, you should have, people don't have to be of a particular place to inhabit it imaginatively.
Another question that is often asked is, who was your ideal reader in the process of writing? So even before you think about the book going on the market, was there an ideal reader that you had, that you kind of imagined for yourself that helped you write the book?
I think maybe it's a little self-involved to say this, but I think in some ways it's readers like me, people who are whose parents may have immigrated, who have this sort of hybrid experience, cultural experience. I think I was for a while a little bit nervous about how Egyptians in Egypt might read it. I've received really lovely feedback since the book has come out that kind of has quelled my my self-consciousness about that. But I do think as a way to just free myself to write this story, I thought about it more as like English language readers who are looking for the story that I was looking for a long time and not really finding in the world.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about, you know, the kind of reception that the book has had, and, you know, some of the questions that have come across. What would you say, in the first few months, you know, in these few months that the book has existed in the world, what would you say are the questions or some of the questions that have been asked that, you know, that you have found enchanting or surprising, you know, things that kind of made you think beyond what you had thought, you know, like discussions that arose around it?
I think there are a couple of things. I think one that I was asked relatively recently that I've been thinking about since, and may try to write an essay about, is this idea of cultural translation, and whether is that what I'm trying to do as a writer? How do I see myself in that role? And sort of what, again, I think that speaks to audience. Who are you writing for? Who are you trying to potentially convey this world that you're writing about? Yeah, I find that sort of an interesting question. I guess just because I don't want my book to take on any kind of like monolithic representation. It's not going to, but my tendency is to think that it's one voice, hopefully among many voices. And so it feels a little bit, I don't know, it feels like a kind of a big burden in some ways to be like, okay, well, I'm the cultural translator for this. I am the cultural translator of this specific experience for these characters that I invented, and it touches on experiences that I've had. But I would feel that, yeah, it would be a mistake to just look to my book to understand what, you know, the larger experience of Egyptians in America is. Like, I think that's a problem for anything. You shouldn't ever attribute like the kind of like take this specific and make it into like the representative whole. But I think the other thing that's come up a lot that's a little challenging to talk about without giving anything away is just the choices I made about whether to bring closure to like one very large mystery in the book. And I think it's sort of a polarizing choice. I've gotten support on it on the one hand. On the other hand, some people are like, well, that was frustrating. And where's the sequel? And why did you do that? And I did write it differently. I wrote it with more of a conclusive ending, but it honestly, like tonally, I think it was a more depressing book, and I didn't really like the closure that I had inserted into it earlier. But ultimately, I'll say that I really wanted, like, so the different perspectives, once you move away from the character who essentially disappears in the center of the book, you're left with the people who are left behind, and their experience is not to have closure or not to have answers. And so their lives are sort of about making peace with that, and just sort of moving on in spite of not having resolution with this major loss in their lives, and sort of reckoning with grief and with loss. And so that I stand by it in that way, but that's something that's come up, I think, in every single conversation that I've done, almost every conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we often want clear answers. And I think that, to me, one of the beauties of the book is exactly that, is that, you know, you get a sense of openness, and also it kind of allows you to focus on the experience of those who remain. So yeah, I'm not one of those who disputed in any way this. I loved it the way it is. We have only a few minutes left. So I think we have gone over the main questions here. I will just maybe invite Dana to come back, and if there are any additional questions that I haven't seen, or that, you know, it's time to wrap up. Thank you so much for your time, Dalia. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you so
and-
much.
Thank you.
Before I wrap up, we just do actually have one last question. So thank you, Ladan, for that. The question is, what comes next for you, Dalia? Can you tell us about your next book?
Sure. Well, yeah, I can tell you about the book that I worked on in various moments when I sort of needed a break from country of origin, and I'm working on in my brain, not so much on my computer these days. But it's a story, like I was referring to earlier, about Westerners in Egypt during what is referred to as the Belle Epoque, like when a lot of Westerners were wintering in Egypt, when it was like part of the grand tour to explore the Holy Land, and when essentially Egypt was basically divvying up its cultural treasures with the foreign companies that would come and invest in those excavations, which is something I find so fascinating as a human, but also as like a museum professional. Just that was sort of that was the arrangement with the antiquities department, the antiquities service, that it was essentially a 50-50 split if the French or the British or whomever Americans invested it. And they weren't supposed to take away anything of major significance, but in fact, that happened a lot. And especially right now, there's so many questions about repatriation, which is that's something that I find myself so interested in, that whole debate, that it takes me back to this book again, and sort of thinking about exploitation of resources, but also the sort of East-West tension.
No, that's really fascinating. I'm sure you know that Nefertiti is one of the symbols of Berlin.
Absolutely. That's one of the ones I think I don't know. I've written an op-ed that I haven't sent out that really centers on that. I was talking about that in the Rosetta Stone, but the Rosetta Stone I think is trickier. So maybe I should just focus on Nefertiti's bust and try to get it out there.
Yeah, well, we'd look forward to reading it whenever you get it out. I think, well, that brings us to close to the end of the hour. Thank you, Dalia and Ladan. We at the Columbia Global Center Amman truly appreciate the riveting conversation of this past hour. You've given us a lot to think about, especially in terms of cultural appropriation and also cultural translation, topics of representation and visibility in the diaspora, and a lovely discussion on the craft of constructing, as Ladan put it. We would also like to thank everyone who sent in questions and our audience for joining us in our book talk series. A recording of this virtual book talk will be available on our website and on our social media platforms afterwards. Thank you.